And so now it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Clive Nwonka. Dr. Clive, thanks so much for coming on the pod.
Thank you for having me. It's amazing.
We just discussed this moments ago that I was going to call you Dr. Nwonka, not Dr. Clive. This is obviously challenging because also here with me now is Clive. Hello, Clive.
Hello.
And so we discussed this. We're going to refer to the author, Clive, as Dr. Nwonka, rightfully so, as an academic with that doctorate. And so it is a respectful way to do it, but also a way to remind Clive once, for the only time ever, that we have someone more learned, more knowledgeable, more educated on the podcast than himself. And this is a proud moment for me. So, Dr. Nwonka, it's great to have you on. I should just mention that there was a big event at Arsenal last night to celebrate the launch of your book. And maybe before we even get into the book, why you wrote it, the significance of it, Clive, your part in it as well. Dr. Nwonka, can you maybe just tell us a little bit about the event that happened at Arsenal and what that sort of meant to you and the club's embracing of this project?
It was amazing. So we had a private launch at the Emirates Stadium last night, overlooking the pitch in the Royal Oak Suite, and I was flabbergasted with the amount of effort and dedication that the club put into the event. There were former players there. There were members of the Arsenal community, those who work at grassroots level, former existing players, and a whole range of different people who all have some kind of affinity to the club in some way. So for me, I was really humbled to just see what kind of work has gone behind the scenes, in a really busy period as well for Arsenal, for them to kind of put that kind of dedication into an event about a book. So there was something that was very, very unprecedented about it. That was certainly my feedback from people who I spoke to who've been around the club for much, much longer than I have. So yeah, it was a wonderful, wonderful day.
It's brilliant. Now, I have to say, look, I didn't come to love Arsenal because of its multiculturalism, because of the way the club and the fans sort of embraced that aspect of culture and society. But I will say that it's become something that over the years has been a thing I'm proud of and been a thing that I think is really important to me in the way that I've been drawn closer to the club and feel more connected to it. And so, a book like this really celebrating something that I think makes the club special is so nice to have. And we'll talk a little bit later on in the pod how people can get their hands on it, and we'll actually have an ability to win a signed copy of it as well. But Clive, before we get into the book a little more deeply, there may be some people who are wondering about your involvement in it. So can you explain how you're involved in the project, maybe your thoughts on the event and what it meant to you to participate in the curation of something like this?
Yeah, I think Dr. Clive rang me up and said...
I thought we were going with Dr. Nwonka. We did this whole prep. We landed on Dr. Nwonka, and you and I have both messed it up already.
I've blown it. Well, Dr. Nwonka rang me up, and basically we started talking on the phone with Matt, who's the co-author, is that right? A co-editor? And they rang me, and I just was immediately taken by the project and immediately taken by what they're trying to do. And I just started talking. I don't think I stopped talking for about 15 minutes. I didn't give them a chance to even say anything. And by the end of it, we decided that I would do a few words and just try to show sort of the why Arsenal for me, and what that journey was like. And I'm a man in my middle age, so I've been there a while. I've been there a while, and since the late 70s, and it's grown over the years. But that time was a different time. So to talk about that time and then bring it forward to the current day was really sort of the approach I took.
Yeah, and I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want to suggest remotely that prejudice, racism have been eradicated by any means. But I think for younger fans, there's an acceptance of what the fans look like in the crowd, right? When you go to the Emirates now, there's an acceptance of the integration and multiculturalism of the club as normal and as standard. But as we know, there have to be trailblazers. There have to be moments where change happens to allow us to get to a point where it looks like it does today. In U.S. sport, we know about trailblazers like Jackie Robinson, right? And people that have to go through things to help create change. So I think it is a great way for people to sort of realize and remember the role Arsenal played in making that change happen. There's a story that Ian Wright shared that was so interesting at his live podcast in LA about a moment when when Highbury was being remodeled, and they put up I guess, what would you call it? Sort of like a banner of fans,
a mural,
basically a mural,
and it was,
right, of fans.
It was discussed last night, wasn't it, Dr. Nwonka? So it's discussed last night at length. So maybe you can complete that story even.
Well, yeah, that's what I was going to go, Dr. Nwonka. If you would share, because I think it's a fascinating story about the things we take for granted and the way change happens, and someone speaking up to make change happen. And then you fast forward several years, and it seems so obvious, but it had to start somewhere. Do you want to just maybe share that anecdote? I think it's a great one.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Clive mentioned, it was referenced a couple of times by the great Paul Davis, who of course was around at the time during it. So when I was putting together the book and I was thinking about the particular chapters and themes that I wanted, I remembered the mural as a child, and I thought it was a very, very important part of that. So I asked Amy Lawrence, who's a fantastic writer, who was there to offer, a reflection on that. So, in 1992, of course, based on the outcomes of the Taylor report into the Hillsborough disaster, the brand new Premier League and all these clubs were changing the nature of their grounds to make them all-seater.
Mm-hmm.
So, of course, the famous North Bank had been knocked down to build a beautiful kind of all-seater stand. So during that summer, of course, there was nothing but a building site there. Now, for those who are old enough like me to remember the first day of the new Premier League in 1992, on match day, most of the ground simply had like 3 working stands, then a kind of an empty one, which had like cranes and kind of building sites on. Now, David Dean thought, let's do something different for that. So he commissioned for there to be a board covering the whole of the North Bank and the building site behind, and an illustration of the fan base to give it a bit more of an atmosphere on match day than simply a building site. Now, I'd done loads of research on thinking about what happened there and speaking to kind of people both in the club and beyond. And what transpired was this. They had a training day, I think on Thursdays, where they train at Highbury before the Saturday historically. And Kevin Campbell was training on the pitch with other kind of players, and he noticed that the illustration - mural had no images of black fans. They were all white. Now, for him, as someone who was black and someone who supported the club and had a connection to the fan base, he recognized instantly that that isn't a reflection of what the true fan base is. It's a multicultural, multiracial fan base. So he immediately and boldly, he's still a young player, went to David Dean, and he called David Dean over and goes, I'm looking at this mural. Do you notice anything particular? And David Dean could see nothing wrong. He goes, where are my brothers? And immediately they made sure that there were black faces in the mural for the following home game. Now, that was an amazing story that was relayed to me by Ian Wright, by Paul Davis and many others. And it needed a central place in the book because it says so much about not just simply Kevin Campbell and the kind of person he was, but also about expectations of Arsenal. What may seem to be acceptable for other clubs, even in 1992, was unacceptable for Arsenal. And the multiracial fan base is something that's instinctive to the Arsenal culture. And that's really why the book was written.
Yeah, that's a brilliant story. And obviously, rest in peace, Kevin Campbell. Great story about Kevin. And I think, it's a story that highlights the distance we travel in the sense that I can't imagine you could put up a mural like that today without everyone immediately noticing the issue with it, right? But there was a moment, and not a moment that long ago in time, where that could be done without anybody noticing there was something wrong with it, and someone has to speak up, and someone has to be an advocate for that change. And so, that comes from the players. It then permeates through the club. It certainly is reflected in the fan base. Clive, you've spoken a bit about this on the pod in the past, but once upon a time when you were in the terraces, when you were going to certain grounds, it wasn't like it is now. You weren't getting hugs from people thanking you for your podcast and ushering you to club level. It was a little bit of a different time. And so, again, for people who take for granted, maybe you can just kind of reiterate the journey and why Arsenal has been a home for you and why you speak about it with such reverence and love because of the way you were able to develop this bond with a football club at a time when at other clubs that might not have been possible.
Yeah, it's a bit of a personal story, right? And I didn't realize how much it was in me until I started to write for the book. Actually, I've never really told it, and basically, not just for me, but for many people, that was what was so good about the event. you met people that have been through something similar. And so you realize, even just today, that it wasn't just you. And so there was a period in the UK, in England in particular, when there was a lot of far right activism going on, and the football grounds was a place where that was acted out. Right. So, and when you went to football, you'd get overt racism. You'd have to be quite light on your feet to get around certain people, and so it was just a different time. It was a different time, but Arsenal never was like that. So when I was young, I went to the Caribbean on the holidays, and then my nickname was English. And when I was in England, I wasn't, I wasn't English, right? So there was no identity, no home, right? But basically, when I went to Arsenal, it just felt immediate that was a place where it didn't matter who you were an Arsenal person, and that was it. And there were so many people from different parts of society. It just felt like a natural place, and but more so in the fan base, you weren't alone, and Paul Davis was talking about this yesterday, and he was talking about how difficult it was for him on the pitch, and he was getting real bad abuse. And actually, from some of those occasions, I was actually in the stands while he was getting that abuse. And then you have to get out of that ground and get to your train or to your bus. And so it was just, when I wrote it, I didn't think people would believe me. Honestly, I thought they're going to think, actually, this is just beyond belief. But actually, sort of recent issues in the UK around far right activism, have maybe brought some of that to the forefront again. And I know it's a different situation, but it reminds people of what things can be like. So, interesting times, Elliot, but we're in a better place today. That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah, certainly. Look, no one wants to be the person sitting here patting ourselves on the back saying, congratulations, we did it. We solved it. And Arsenal's the reason. But I think it is also good to celebrate moments of progress and celebrate organizations and communities that help make progress possible, right? So that's a fine line to walk when you see, Vinicius Jr., for example, having to put out a statement saying, if we get racist abuse again, Real Madrid are going to walk off the pitch, in 2024. So it's not great. And as you referenced, some of the far right activism that we've seen in the UK, and I can get into what happens in the US as well, but it's all well documented. So, Dr. Nwonka, in terms of writing this book through an Arsenal lens, from an Arsenal perspective, obviously that's why it's relevant to us here doing this podcast and listening to this podcast. But for you, why was this the story you wanted to tell? Why was this a lens through which you wanted to observe this phenomenon? Obviously, there's a lot of areas where you could focus your efforts and your talents to discuss multiculturalism and integration, but you chose Arsenal. Why that specifically?
I mean, it's a fantastic question.
Thanks. Clive wrote it and sent it to me.
That makes sense. So, I've been an academic for nearly 10 years now, and I research on, race and media representation. And I was thinking a lot at the time about my own cultural background coming from Northwest London, which is a very, very kind of densely kind of black area, just a stone's throw from Wembley Stadium. And, it was apparent to me, even as a young boy, that Arsenal seemed to have a particular place in the hearts of black people around me, whether that's me going to church on a Sunday or in the community centres or the Pan-African school or the barbershop, to be involved in that kind of quote unquote black talk, was to reference Arsenal in the early 90s in some capacity, whether you're talking about Ian Wright or Kevin Campbell or Rocky Rocastle or Mickey Thomas or beyond, that was what kind of people associated with, and it was inescapable. So in thinking back to those times, I realised that Arsenal has a central place, I think, in contemporary Black British culture and identity. And I want to explore the reasons why. I mean, of course, I think there are particular moments. So I talk in the book a lot about 89 and that particular game. I talk a lot about the Premier League and Ian Wright emerging as the poster boy for the Premier League, doing those Chocolate Quest adverts and the Nike adverts and things. And for me, it was rare to kind of see a black person, a black footballer, taking prominence in culture in that way. So I thought there was a deep, deep history there to explore, which meant not just thinking about the current day, but also thinking about the past, going back to Brendan Batson, going back to exploring what Islington was like in the 50s and 60s and 70s, thinking about the club culture itself in the 80s and 90s, be it former players or staff who work, on the door in security, who've been at the Highbury days for years and years and years. There's so much that I thought was worth exploring to actually really understand why Arsenal is always associated with multicultural difference in a way that other clubs just aren't as well.
Yeah, well, I'll stay with you just for a second. So you mentioned some players there. Paul Davis is one that you mentioned that I think is a really important figure in the book, in Arsenal history, and people may not be as familiar with sort of his journey and his importance in this story, and obviously, as a result, importance to the book. Can you maybe speak just a little bit about him specifically and why he is such an important figure, not from a footballing standpoint, which I think people at this point are probably familiar with, but in terms of why he's an important figure in this story specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I was someone who always appreciated Paul Davis as a young person. And I think I realized his importance more than anything else when we did a talk at the Barbican in 2022. I spent, of course, several years putting together a scaffold. And I think, what I wanted from the book. And Matthew Hull, the co-editor, worked at the Barbican and is an Arsenal season ticket holder and is very much connected to the terrace culture. And I'd asked him if I could do a talk at the Barbican with my ideas. It ended up being, a huge event that sold out within 24 hours. And I'd spoken to the club, and Paul Davis attended. And he offered a wonderful impromptu speech at the end, just talking about how he didn't realize how much he'd done, for people, the Black community, while I was at Arsenal. And it's amazingly kind of important to him. So I realized that he was someone who really linked the past to the present. If you think about when he first joined Arsenal as a young boy from Lewisham in the late 70s, he may have been the only Black player in his youth team for a period of time until Chrissy White came along. He would have been going to away games, he kind of a player on the pitch. He came through all those kind of times with different kind of managers in the 80s before George Graham came, when Arsenal weren't so successful, a lot of pressure on players to perform. And he won 2 league titles, so he's seen everything. So I thought his story, which is called Black Arsenal in 3 Acts, is the best way for someone actually within the changing rooms to narrate what it's like in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and the present. Because without Paul Davis's sacrifices and efforts and presence, maybe a Rocky Rocastle wouldn't have come through the youth system. Maybe a Kevin Campbell wouldn't have come to prominence. Maybe a Mickey Thomas wouldn't have come through. It allowed for Ian Wright to become what Ian Wright was. It allowed for Thierry Henry to be recognised in the same way. It then allowed for Saka to become the next kind of torchbearer. So I think he's so important in kind of the history and lineage of, Black, players coming through and representing themselves.
Yeah. Clive, do you want to add to that just a little bit?
Perhaps? Yeah. I mean, Paul Davis is a hero of mine, not just because he's an Arsenal player, but because of how he carried himself in more difficult times. And he was just a graceful, wonderful player. And he's a graceful man, and very lucky enough to meet him last night and really talk to him. And that was a life moment I won't forget. And because when people impact you through your youth and maybe help form you, they don't realize it. And when I was to tell him, Elliot should have seen his face. He was like taken aback. He said he just didn't realize when he was out there the impact he was having on other people. And I put myself right on that list. And he's a really great person. And I'm very fortunate to have spent some time with him, and listen to him and learn from him. And I think he's absorbing his own impact, as I said earlier, to many different people and hopefully getting comfort with it, because he's going to hear it from many other people. I don't think he's almost like the silent people just stayed there, didn't say anything, but they're now telling him to his face. So I think he's having a really positive impact on him.
I think it's so incredible to consider the character of people who had to go that path at that time in the world. I referenced Jackie Robinson before, and his story is arguably one of the most famous, certainly in this country, of a pioneer who trailblazed integration in sports, crossing the color line in baseball in America, and what he went through, death threats in every single town where he played, not being allowed to to sleep in the same places with his teammates or shower in the same places with his teammates, things like that. And you think about how hard it is to make it in professional sport, whatever sport that is, right? The immense pressure just to perform. Think about a player today with, I would say, a very different kind of dynamic. Or think about a white player, the pressure they're under, the challenges they face, the difficulty in succeeding. Now layer onto that all the other things we're talking about. Not being able to be part of the team, not being able to have the support of your fans, having your life put potentially at risk simply for the crime of playing the sport you love and still thriving. I think that takes an extraordinary level of not just talent, but perseverance. And so, there's something special about a person who can not only confront all the regular stresses and challenges of trying to make it in elite sport, but these additional challenges that are put upon them simply by virtue of the color of their skin. So it is a remarkable journey. And I think that's something that leads me, Dr. Nwonka, to discuss maybe the contemporary moment, which is, as you've done this sort of excavation and watched the development, to see Ian Wright become the face of Arsenal former players, right? The face of marketing campaigns and the face of social media campaigns. And then Bukayo Saka, the face of the playing side of the club, after it having been Thierry Henry for a while as well, right? And that evolution, having done this excavation, looked at this history, written this book, how special and unique is it that we arrive in this place, in this moment with these players, given the path we've traveled?
Absolutely. I mean, Ian Wright, if I can censor him for a moment, I mean, I'm not quite sure that any player in the modern era in British football has had the kind of legacy and renaissance and kind of sustained kind of importance culturally as Ian Wright. I mean, he was the original, Premier League poster boy. And, almost 30 years later, he's probably even more relevant culturally than he was in 1992, 1993.
Yeah.
And I think it just says everything about him. I think, he's someone that I looked up to immensely and appreciated, throughout the 90s and beyond. And, the fact that he's still working with the club, that he's doing, cameos in Adidas adverts, the impact he's kind of made, and that young people who now go to Arsenal who are 11, 12 years old, may not know every single kind of player who played for Arsenal in the 90s or even the 2000s, but they make an association between Ian Wright and Arsenal. And that is immensely rare in a contemporary situation. It seems like he's as significant to the present day as Bukayo Saka himself. So to have a book that kind of unites those two legacies, I think is amazing. So in his chapter, he talks immensely proudly about the sense of, achievement that he feels in seeing Bukayo Saka and a Reece Nelson come through, and Eddie Nketiah, and those people who've, carried on the tradition of having young black players, often from South London, come through the academy and represent the club. So, yeah, I think Ian Wright is someone who is, so central to the book. He's on the front cover, but he's referenced throughout in all recollections, be it historical ones or, more recent ones as well. And it's a privilege to be able to interview him for the book as I did.
Clive, your thoughts on that?
Well, Ian is a hero as well. We podcast together, but I've only just learned the art of speaking when I'm next to him. So that's a challenge for a podcaster, because you can't help but feel just lift him up on a pedestal, really. And but to be honest, he is such a giving person. He's very successful, but he wants people to come on the journey with him. He will always bring people with him. He shares his success with other people. And, they say don't meet your heroes, right? But I've met two in the last few weeks that I'm so glad that I've met. And they've only made me, I hope, a better, more rounded person.
Yeah, well said. So as we start to turn the corner to wrap up here, I think one of the things, Dr. Nwonka, that I want to make sure I do is give you some room to talk about, what this has meant to you and what you want people to know about this book and about this project that don't fit neatly into some question that I can ask that leads you just to the right place. I want to give you some space to just articulate the importance of this for you and what people should know about it that I think will enlarge understanding of the club and enhance their connection to the club. So is there something that maybe we haven't touched on that you really want to make sure people are aware of?
Yeah, a couple of things. I mean, I think firstly, on a very, very kind of serious point, I mean, and I think this was expressed, last night and in my other talks with the club as well, is this is an exploration of the Black community in London and the UK and beyond, and their gravitation towards Arsenal, as opposed to maybe kind of Arsenal's kind of gravitation towards the Black community. And I think that is changing now, and I'm convinced that the club have now recognised what they have, within their club culture. I think it's quite important that the book is called Black Arsenal: Club Culture and Identity. So I think about the club not simply in terms of the bricks and mortar or the organizational structures or the hierarchies or the exec board or even simply the fans. It's a broader culture that involves people, on the streets or in schools or in the community centres, all the places, the restaurants, the barbershops that may have a connection to Arsenal through being supporters or family. That's what the club culture is. And of course, Clive can talk about that much more than I can because he's been going for 30, 40 years. So it's about how various different points of interaction, find some kind of affinity with that club. And I just hope that Arsenal fans, even non-Arsenal fans, will kind of find some, interest in the book or some kind of personal connection. But I think also on a more kind of lighter note, I've had, the most incredible 10 years, 7 years, and more recently 2 years, working on the book and being hosted and facilitated by the club in so many different ways, either in the community centres, the hub, or, in the stadium, talking to supporters and fans, but also in the training ground. And I've got an anecdote to share, if you don't mind.
Oh, I'd love that. Yeah.
Which actually nearly, I thought, may have come to the end of the book before it even got published.
Just before you give it, we're recording this on deadline day. Is the anecdote that you've seen a forward at London Colney who's about to be signed? Because that would be super.
I wish I had that inside info, but unfortunately, I don't. I think Clive's the man for that kind of knowledge.
Sorry. Had to do it.
But yeah, so I want to cast your mind back to last year and October. So I was asked by the club as an honour to edit the matchday programme for the home game against Sheffield United, which was to mark Arsenal's Black History Month celebrations. I worked very, very closely with Andy Exley and his team to put it together. An amazing, amazing programme. So in the days leading up to that, I was asked to go down to London Colney and interview Reece Nelson. So got there nice and early before training. The idea was that I was to interview Reece before training, and then let them train as they were flying out to Seville for the Champions League away game that afternoon. Some timekeeping issues took place. But so I was happy to let Reece, have his breakfast and then kind of train. And then in between kind of flying out, we would do the interviews then. So I'm standing by the entrance to the first team cafeteria at London Colney, and the players are coming in. Now, they don't know who I am or what I'm doing there, but every single one came up to me and shook my hand and greeted me and was very, very welcoming. Odegaard, a lovely, lovely young man, very, very kind of classy and polite, came up to me, shook my hand. Saliba, Martinelli, White, Ramsdale, all of them were really, really gracious. As was Thomas Partey. Now, he came up to me, but rather than kind of hold his hand out to shake it, he held his fist out. So, okay, cool, I'm with that. So I gave him a little kind of spud. Now, bear in mind, Thomas is a big guy, as I am as well. A lot of force went into our spuds. So as we kind of connected, he kind of just grabbed his fist like he was going to hurt. I was like, "Oh, okay, have I hurt you?" He goes, "No, I'm okay," but it looks like a bit of kind of discomfort, and then went into the canteen. I thought nothing of it. And eventually, after training, I think before training or something, I sat down with kind of Reece, and we had our wonderful interview, which is in the program. And then I was going home, got home, and just began kind of going through social media, and I think one of the BBC kind of news reports. And to my horror, I read that Thomas Partey didn't train that day because he had an injury and wasn't flying out to Seville and will be now staying in London for treatment on long-term injury. And I swear to God, my heart just sank, then started kind of palpitating because I genuinely thought I've actually injured Thomas Partey with that kind of fist pump. I'm going to get sued by the club. The book's going to be over. That is me done. I'm finished. So I spent the whole evening trying to contact any single Arsenal side I knew to find out the extent of the injury, what was happening, what the reaction was. Am I now like a marked man by the club? Literally, I couldn't sleep for the whole evening thinking like the book is over now. I am finished. It took me a whole day to find out that actually wasn't a hand injury, but a hamstring injury.
Yeah.
And I wasn't responsible for kind of keeping out the Seville game and actually half the season. So I lived to fight another day, and the book became what it was. But yeah,
That's
for 24 hours, I thought, I'm in serious trouble here. So
that's great. To be honest, I think it would have been a relief to everyone at Arsenal had it been a hand injury, because I think you could have called me up and I would have told you it's most likely a soft tissue injury. So yeah, we would have taken a knuckle injury. I think that would have been fine. But that is a great story. In fact, here I'll share one back to you just real quick. By virtue of a very strange job I had many years ago, I had the pleasure of being in the same place with George Foreman, the famous boxer, and George Foreman, very big guy, known for his knockout power. That was what he was known for. And so, I'm just standing there and he's standing next to me. He's like, how's it going? I was like, hey, champ, you're great. Love you. He's like, thanks. And he gave me the little sort of like fake little punch in the belly thing. You know what I mean? He's like, all right, here's one from the champ. And then he walked away. And like, it took me about 30 seconds to get my breath back. And I wound up having a bruise on my stomach just from this little like light tap he gave me. But this guy, he still had the knockout power. Let me tell you that. So in that case, the injury was the other way around. I obviously do not have the power to hurt anybody, but George Foreman did give me a nice little bruise on my stomach to take away. So
Jesus, wow.
There you go. Yeah, very powerful man. Anyway,
can I ask a question? Can I ask a question, Elliot? And just because obviously, Clive, you sort of you're London yourself. So some of the stories you would have had an inkling of, or an understanding of. Was there anything that came up in the book that really surprised you? And or was there something in there also that was really confirmed by the themes that came out in the book in your mind?
Wow, those are two amazing questions, and I'll definitely try and answer them. I mean, as someone who obviously is a Londoner and grew up around Arsenal fans, many of my kind of close friends from school were in attendance last night, and who took me to games as a teenager, and I thought that I'd done a pretty good job in researching objectively all the details that I needed. But there were always, stories and anecdotes that you just didn't know. I mean, I think one important one that kind of thought about talking was, Paul Davis. My time with him was fantastic, and he gave me such an insight into things that kind of happened during the George Graham years. And one of the things that he spoke about that was quite important to me was Gus Caesar, and who was in attendance last night. And it was always in my mind to have him acknowledged because, I think people often forget that he was someone who was immensely talented and came through, a really, really kind of competitive kind of youth system at Arsenal to break through, and actually kind of broke through earlier than some of his contemporaries that we now love and cherish. And, he played and came into the Arsenal back four at a time when Arsenal was still in transition, under George Graham, and did quite well for a number of kind of games, as Clive will know much more than I would. And I just thought it was really important that kind of people kind of understood, his own journey there. Because I think sometimes he seems to be kind of player that maybe hasn't been given the respect he deserves, if I can say that.
Yeah.
I thought it was very important that he was kind of given more respect and understanding. So I asked questions to Paul about him. He said to me that, after, even before the Luton game in 1988, where people associate him with the winning goal, there was always kind of murmurs and kind of mumbles about him, about his performances. But he was always someone who carried a huge pressure on his shoulders as a very, very young player. And what Paul told me was, in today's game, him having trained, youngsters at the club for many, many years, there'll be much more support for young players coming through at big clubs if they make a mistake that kind of leads to a kind of goal or things. But under George Graham in the 80s, there didn't seem to be that, maybe because of the times. And I think all clubs maybe would have been paid the same way, but there wasn't a kind of arm around the shoulder, keep your head up, let's keep going. And I think maybe kind of Gus was someone who's kind of playing in today's game. There'd have been much more kind of support around him as a very, very young player after the Luton game. So that was a real kind of insight into what things were like. The other thing very, very quickly to mention was Ian Wright, just talking as he does in the book. about the way he, used to feel that, particular referees had it in for him, without naming names. But, he would discuss about how even in, the tunnel, they'd come up to him and say, "You're a marked man, like, no nonsense today, you're going to get brought to get kind of sent off." And, I think for many people, maybe outside of the Arsenal community who were going to the games, didn't really understand the way or the reasons why Ian Wright carried himself the way he did on the pitch, is because, in many kind of games, he was fighting both the crowd who were against him, away fans, but also sometimes the referees, who, would maybe target him or kind of associate him with kind of negative kind of characteristics, and treat him unfairly sometimes. So hearing him talk about, the ways in which, it hurt him so much, having to kind of take on all that labor, propelled him on to do well. But it made him celebrate the way he celebrated, because it's like, almost two fingers up, at particular authority. So those are two big eye-openers for me in the book.
That's really interesting. And it goes back to something I was talking about earlier too, right? Just think of the perseverance it takes to succeed when you're starting not at the same starting point of everybody else, but with a huge disadvantage, right? Fans already on your back for no reason, referees determined to make the game harder for you. You have to be that much better just to get back to baseline, which is pretty incredible. Yeah. I think that's remarkable. Clive, you want to final word here? I think we sort of run into the time we've asked from Dr. Nwonka, so I want to be cognizant of that as well.
Well, I have to say, I couldn't stop smiling at the event, and we're having a conversation here which is a bit more serious, but there's so much to be positive about. I was so pleased to see so many people, to be there for you, Clive, and to see what was, to really appreciate the club were so good with the event. And they put on lots of events, but you could feel the genuine feeling behind this event. You could really feel it. And it was all over the room. You could see people that knew the stories. You could see people that were learning the stories for the first time. I sat next to Tim, and Tim was just transfixed listening to what's going on. And Tim has got a long background at Arsenal, a very historical background. So I think it was a fantastic evening from an education point of view, from a cultural point of view, and from an Arsenal point of view. And that's who we all are, right? We're all Arsenal people, and I cannot tell you, it's a night that will live in my memory for a long time. A long time.
That's beautiful. Yeah, football changes your life in an instant, right? A ball goes in the back of the net, and suddenly everything changes. But a club connects to you and builds community and creates tradition over years and years and years. And I think it's easy to miss the journey because you're living it moment by moment. You're living it goal by goal, tackle by tackle, save by save. And those are the things, are we getting this transfer? Did the ball go in the net? Did we get the 3 points? Those are the things that we live and breathe every day. But this is a beautiful chance to sort of stop for a minute and reflect on the distance we've traveled and all the reasons why we feel so much affection for the club and for one another, and why it becomes such a special community, because we don't often do that. As we sit here and record this today, right? I'm desperately trying to just keep the phone out of sight because it's blowing up with anxiety over transfers, right? We live that way in those moments, but we connect over the years and over the journey that we go on together. And so, Dr. Nwonka, I want to thank you for the book. Obviously, I think it's going to mean a lot to a lot of people. It already means a lot to a lot of people, but a lot of people haven't had a chance to read it yet. They will get a chance to. It'll be at all major booksellers. We're going to give a signed copy away, and I will have more on that. But you can look in the show notes for the link where you can enter to win that book. We're going to hear some interviews from the event that we've been referencing that took place at Arsenal. Tim had the chance to interview some people, so I'm going to roll in those interviews as well. But I just want to extend my gratitude to you, not just for the project, but for the opportunity to chat to you. There's an event on Thursday of this week that the pod is out, but there's also an event in October. So quickly, do you want to give us the details of that for anyone who wants to attend?
Yeah, sure. So there's going to be a public launch of the book in October, which is part of the London Literary Festival at the South Bank Centre. And you can see, if you go onto the South Bank Centre kind of website, and there'll be a link there to booking. There's still plenty of tickets remaining, and I'll be in conversation with a number of kind of guests talking about the book, its process, and, what I hope people can get from the book, both within the Arsenal community and beyond.
Yeah, that's great. So for anybody who wants to attend that, it'd be great to be there and be a part of that event. The Thursday event that's going on is sold out. So, Dr. Nwonka, you'll probably see some people listening to this there. Thank you again for being on. Thank you again for the book. And hopefully we can talk to you down the road a little bit about how it's been received and how it's going.
Thanks for having me.
Clive, as always, a pleasure to speak to you. You and I have some business to attend to later, freaking out about news that's breaking as we record this. The funny thing is, by the time people hear this, they will not want to be reminded of the day that we are referencing, because it'll be in our rearview mirror, and we'll all just be happy about the 3 points against Brighton that we achieved on Saturday, he says, knowing the future. But thank you for being a part of it as well, for your contribution to the book, and for just generally being a dear friend. Love you.
Small part. Thank you very much.
All right, we're going to turn it over to some Tim interviews, and I'll be back to say goodbye to you in a moment, so stay with us.